Welcome back to the channel. Can you guess what we're going to be doing today? I hope so, because I just showed you a little bit, and there'll be more of that later. But first, we need to solve a few problems. If you're new to the channel, well, this is our diesel-powered 1989 Chevy S10. Now, back in the day, you could get a diesel S10, but this ain't one of them. You see, those are really hard to find, so we just built our own, which is not as hard as you would think. Now, if you're wondering, how hard could it be to slap something like this together? Well, check out our previous videos. I cover pretty much every step we took to install this robust and very reliable Volkswagen diesel engine in the truck. We're using a simple, normally aspirated 1.6 liter engine because it was free, but there are several more powerful variants of this engine that would also work just fine. Anyway, enough talk. Let's just jump right into the action. So in the previous video, we were able to get the diesel engine to fire up, which was a major milestone for this project. However, we did discover there was a fuel leak coming from the vicinity of the high pressure fuel injector pump, and that sucks. As you can see, the fuel was literally pouring out from around the pump, which was a disappointment to say the least. But the good news is the engine ran and it sounded great. So you might ask, where was the fuel leak coming from? Well, let's take a look at the cartoon. This guy is the fuel injector pump that feeds fuel to the diesel engine. It was hard to tell, but the leak looked like it was coming from this area. If this is true, then this is sort of an easy fix. You see, between the fuel pump body and the fuel distributor head, there's an O-ring that'll fail given enough time, and since this engine's exactly 40 years old, well, the O-ring is likely the culprit. So working on an injector pump can be intimidating because it's a precision piece of machinery, but it turns out any idiot can fix these things. So our plan is to loosen the bolts that hold this fuel distributor head on, and that'll provide enough space to fish out the perished O-ring, and according to a bunch of YouTube videos, we can then install the new O-ring. Once the new O-ring's in place, then we can crank down on the bolts that hold this thingy to the fuel pump body, and Bob's your uncle, or something like that. As you'll see in a few moments, it's a bit sketchy, but this is how the internet people do it, so let's give it a shot. Fast forward a few hours and we're ready to do the injector pump surgery. For this special occasion, I went ahead and built a fixture to hold the pump in the vertical position, and that'll allow you folks a better view of what's going on. Okay, just a heads up, all the bolts have been loosened off camera. Anyway, we need to remove these 4 bolts first in order to get this chunk of metal out of the way. We'll also need to remove this guy, which is the fuel shutoff solenoid. You know, there's always going to be someone who feels I'm not doing something right, or I'm wasting my time doing it the way I do stuff. And sometimes they do have a point. But I think sometimes they also forget that it's a YouTube video and I do stuff a certain way because I have an audience, and that's sort of the whole point when you make videos. Okay, so this is the fuel shutoff solenoid thingy. This is what shuts the engine off when I'm done listening to the little engine clatter, knock, and smoke. This thing needs to be energized with 12 volts in order for the engine to run. Take away the 12 volts and boom, the engine will stop dead. Inside the cavity, we can see a little spring inside this doohickey. Alright, well, let's make sure that spring is still there when this thing goes back together. So at this point, we still have 2 bolts holding the fuel distributor head to the pump. Now keep in mind, I have no idea what I'm doing and I've never played around with one of these Bosch VE pumps before. So just to avoid any weird stuff that may or may not happen, I'm going to install 2 longer bolts so I can get this distributor head to move away from the pump body as much as I can. Remember, I have no idea what's inside this thing and I'm just being cautious. So apparently that's all it's going to move anyway. Let me give you folks a better look at the O-ring that's in question. So this is the 40-year-old O-ring, and I believe this is what's causing our fuel leak. Let's fish it out and replace it with a fresh one. You know, it's a bit tricky to do this, especially when the camera's right in the way. Yeah, in order to give you folks a good view, I have to deal with stuff right in my field of vision. A lot of YouTube creators are better at dealing with the camera than I am, that's for sure. Okay, I got it. The O-ring is definitely brittle, and I have to make sure I pull the whole thing out and not leave any debris behind. Well, this thing is definitely no good, but is it the source of our leak? I guess we'll find out real soon. So this is the sketchy part. The new O-ring has to be stretched to go around the top of the pump. Now, I did put a little bit of petroleum jelly on the O-ring to help it slide, and that's actually making this a lot more difficult to do. And it's in. What a relief. So I guess that's it. At this point, I can just reassemble the pump. You know, stretching the O-ring was a bit sketchy, but honestly, it was pretty easy. This shortcut is the recommended way to deal with the O-ring, and I'm not sure what the alternative is, but I reckon it involves with dealing with stuff I don't want to deal with. So this is a good hack, I guess. Fast forward a few hours and the injector pump is back on the engine. Now, just for fun, let's power up the transfer pump and start pumping fuel through the system. Of course, this won't help our situation at all until I turn the ignition switch on, and that'll energize the solenoid. With power to the solenoid, the fuel can now flow inside the pump. I'm not sure what to expect at this point, but I don't see any fuel leaks, so then again, I'm not sure we would see any without the engine running. Either way, so far, so good. So to avoid any drama on getting this engine started later in the video, let's go ahead and bleed the air out of the high pressure lines before I install the timing belt. Okay, the plan is to spin the pump clockwise with a power drill, and that'll get the fuel moving in the pump and flush out any air in the lines. Keep an eye on this injector, and when you see fuel spraying out of it, then we've successfully purged the lines of any air. And that's good enough for YouTube. Let me put this thing back together and we can fire it up. Stand by. Fast forward a few hours and everything is back together. At this point, we can fire up the engine and see if the O-ring fixed our fuel leak. This should be interesting. Normally, I heavily edit these videos and trim out all the wasted time. I think the videos flow better that way. Now, at this point in the video, the engine would already be running, but not today. Nope, today you get to see the whole process without the edits. Okay, so turn on the ignition switch. Now I have to walk over to the glow plug relay and manually trigger it because I haven't had a chance to finish the wiring yet. Now I have to wait an enormous amount of time, and to fill in the awkward silence while I wait for the glow plugs to get hot, I have to say stuff in order to keep you folks entertained. Normally I cut this part completely out, and as the viewer, you are to assume that I'm doing stuff correctly. But there's always going to be someone who says, "You didn't wait long enough to let the glow plugs get hot." Well, the truth is I did, but I cut that part out because it takes forever, and I don't really have anything to say. So, sure nice weather we've been having. You know, I heard Joe caught a 15-pound bass last week. And cut to the engine starting. Wow, purging the air from the fuel lines with the power drill made a huge difference. Let's take a look at the pump. Well, I see something leaking, but I'm not sure it's fuel. This is interesting. The pump looks fine, and I do have a rattle coming from this loose bracket, but that's not causing the leak. Yep, we definitely have a leak. Now the question is, what's leaking? Because it ain't fuel. Let me turn this thing off and we can do a little bit of investigating. So that appears to be oil, and as I recall, we didn't have an oil leak before, so what's up? Fast forward a few minutes and I found the problem. It turns out someone forgot to install the dipstick tube in the engine block. Yeah, someone really screwed up. So apparently, this dipstick thingy needs to be installed in order to prevent oil leaks. Let me sort this out off camera. Okay, let's try this again, this time with the dipstick gizmo in the engine like it's supposed to be. Oh, for the glow plugs, I'm just going to edit this part out, and you can assume I waited the required amount of time. Well, future Jimbo has assured me that we fixed the fuel leak and we also fixed the oil leak. So in theory, we're good to go for a longer test run. But in order to do that, we're gonna need a radiator. Fast forward many hours and it's true, we did in fact fix both the oil leak and the fuel leak. I double checked everything and we're good to go. Right here I have two fabric cobbled radiator hoses that'll connect the Volkswagen engine to the Chevy radiator. Now that's a weird thing to say, but I said it anyway. Over here we have the front of the truck, and off camera I've already mounted the radiator. So the problem is we need to put all this stuff together and it's going to take a lot of time and effort. So I'm going to do a massive edit, and the next time you see this truck, it's going to look a lot different. And there you go, one 1989 Chevy square body S10 pickup truck with a 1985 Volkswagen Golf 1.6 liter diesel engine. This was the goal of the project from day one, and goal is achieved, for the most part. This time around I have the battery mounted in its original location, and I went ahead and did a bit more wiring, and the glow plugs now have a proper fuse and the correct heavy duty wiring, although the push button to activate the glow plugs is still not hooked up. Over on this side, you can see the fuel filter and the fuel pump are tucked away, and the wheel well is in place to protect these gizmos from road debris. The intake manifold is completely bolted to the engine, but I still haven't had time to rig up a proper air filter. This should be good enough for today. And of course the radiator's been filled with coolant. I actually filled the radiator last night, and the truck's been sitting for over 15 hours now, and I'm happy to report no leaks. Now as a treat, I have a temperature gauge connected. This electronic gauge also has a programmable alarm. It's a cool feature for a $20 gauge. Actually, I think all gauges need to have an alarm. That's a cool feature. Today, I'm going to set the alarm to go off at 195 degrees Fahrenheit. It'll be interesting if the engine can actually get that hot. Anyway, I put a link in the video description if you're interested in picking up one of these for less than a Jackson. Overall, I think we're ready to start it up and verify the cooling system works. Let's do that. I push the truck outside and it's go time. One last look at the engine bay. Yep, it looks fine. Oh, the glow plugs. Well, I'm going to edit this part out because it's the least interesting thing right now. But I did glow the engine for the required amount of time, as I always do. I love that sound. This segment of the video is over an hour and a half long, but it's going to breeze by in a few seconds because I edited out all the dead time. My reality is a lot different than your reality as far as time goes. Anyway, this truck doesn't have a cooling fan yet, so we need to keep an eye on the gauge. So far, so good. No leaks of any kind to report. The fan belt sure likes to flail around. That can't be right. So after 20 minutes, I did have to top off the radiator, and I put a fan in front of it. You know, with a little bit of air blowing across the radiator, the temperature maxes out at 168 degrees Fahrenheit. Interesting. Still no leaks. That's the best news of the day. While waiting for something to happen or not happen, I decided to jack up the rear axle to see if the clutch worked. Well, the clutch works and it sounds like the wheels are spinning, but the speedometer doesn't work. This truck uses a VSS signal and it doesn't have a speedometer cable. Anyway, the speedometer worked before the transplant, so I need to double check the wiring. You know, I may have cut too many wires out of the harness. For me, electrical stuff is easy to troubleshoot, so no worries. And yep, the wheel is spinning. I turned off the fan and I let the temperature creep up to 195 degrees and the silly alarm went off. Let me turn the fan back on and we can see if the temperature will drop. Yep, the cooling system works. You know what that means, right? Yep, now we can take this thing for a ride. Oh, it popped out of gear. Oh no, really? Well, damn, it looks like the transmission's seen better days. Of all things, that was not what I was expecting. Anyway, after fooling around a little bit, it's confirmed. First gear has a problem, and it's not a minor problem. It pops out of gear all the time, and the engagement feels very crunchy. So, we're looking at possibly bad synchros, or worse. For now, the transmission will work, but I'll have to source a second-hand replacement soon. Let's run this rig up the road and see how it goes. Well, if I hold it in gear, we can get it to work a little bit. Crunchy. Now, despite the engine not having a lot of power, this truck goes down the road no problem. So this truck doesn't have the optional power steering, and the way the steering is set up, it feels very light. So the lack of power steering is not going to be a problem. The power brakes are connected to the vacuum pump and the brakes feel great. As I recall, the previous owner did replace the brakes. It's too bad the transmission has a problem. This truck feels great. Now, with the windows open and the hood off and no carpeting on the floor, it's a bit loud. It'll be interesting to see how much we can tone down the noise, but I'm okay with the way it sounds right now. Diesel engines are music to my ears, plus I'm partially deaf anyways.
Today's truck is Chevrolet.
So when I bought the truck a few months ago, the previous owner did say it had a bad transmission, and what I discovered back then was the transmission seemed to work and it was the clutch that was totally burned out. So naturally I assumed the spent clutch was the problem all along and not the transmission. So here's what I think was going on. Since first gear is basically unusable, they were using second gear to take off, and that put a lot of strain on the clutch. That would explain why the clutch was totally burned out. So the current situation is definitely not ideal, but we can still move forward and sort out the truck while I'm on the hunt for a replacement transmission. First gear sort of works good enough to get this rig rolling, and for now that'll work. Now obviously the transmission's a problem. On the other hand, the engine seems to be sorted out as far as no leaks, and it actually runs. Around the neighborhood, the truck seems to be able to get out of its own way despite having only half the horsepower and half the torque of the Iron Duke. Now being a square body, well, this truck is shaped like a brick, so out on the open road at highway speeds, things are certainly going to be different. It'll be interesting to see how this rig performs on the highway. Now as most of you folks know, we don't have hills in this part of Kansas, so that's good. However, we do have a lot of wind on occasion. As a matter of fact, on a windy day, this silly car has its problems, but it can keep up on the expressway if pushed hard enough. Anyway, so far I'm real happy with the results as far as the engine swap goes. The truck still needs this, that, and the other thing, but we'll get there soon enough. I had a lot of fun today and I hope you did as well. We'll see you next time. Until then.